Dr. Martyn Brown, accomplished academic and much more. Today, he's our guest. This is Alex and the Message. And we're live. Hello everyone, welcome to Alex and the Message. Today I have an esteemed guest with me, Dr. Martyn Brown from Birmingham City University. Martyn, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Hi Alex.
Very good. Well, me and Martyn first met back when I was in my first term at Birmingham City University. I think we was doing organisational studies, wasn't we? Something like that. Yeah. And he explained a concept about organisation very clearly, hence he's here today. Do you want to say hello to the listeners, Martyn?
Oh, hi everybody. I hope this is useful.
I'm sure it will be. So, Martyn has had a very, very diverse career path. But before we get into that, let's start from right at the beginning. So, before 1972, I'm guessing around the Colchester area, as your career would suggest.
You've done your homework.
There we go. So, what was going on around that time?
Before 1972?
Before 1972. So before you even start this diverse career path, what was going
on? Goodness me, I left a secondary modern school in 1972, as you say. So before that, I guess I was just loafing around school, didn't really like it very much. And I'm pretty confident the school didn't like me.
Okay.
But I was interested in things, but I didn't like the school environment, so I'm not sure I performed to my best. I'm sure I didn't perform to my best.
Okay.
I'm sure of it. Got an interest in music round there, loved Led Zeppelin and what they used to call progressive rock.
Oh yeah. Back in the day it was progressive, yeah.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was very sophisticated music when I look back, and I now realise that I had no idea what was going on, and it was probably more to do with having long hair than it was to do with the music.
Oh, so okay. So you just enjoyed the long hair sort of
and the festivals, yeah, I think that was probably about it.
Is there any in particular you can remember as like that was the festival that as a youth I remember the most?
I can remember the first one that I went to. It was only a day long in the Oval Cricket Ground in London, and
right.
It cost £2.50. Can you believe that? And we saw there's about 18,000 people in the audience, which by these standards is not very big. But we saw the original Genesis, and we saw Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which were headlining, and I don't know, probably a dozen other major acts for £2.50. So that's what inflation does for you.
Well, there you go, inflation, Jesus. So, how would your friends describe you? Who were your contemporaries at that time?
Probably as a bit of a lad, I think we might have.
A bit of a lad?
Probably, yeah. The class comedian, that's something like that, just attention-gaining stuff, and I think most of my mates knew it.
Okay.
That was about it, really.
All right. So, it comes to, after that, career, having long hair, etc. like that, we move into 1972. So, tell me, how did the heating and ventilation trainee engineer job go for you?
Oh my goodness, because you're trying to forget this stuff and you're trying to bring it on. I just left school in a big hurry, couldn't hack it, and so got a job as what they called a heating and ventilating improver, which basically meant that I was the heating engineer's dog's body, and they paid you very little. You weren't really trained. It was so-called on the job, so it wasn't an apprenticeship or anything like that. And I think I lasted about a year. Managed to get myself run over by a car, and having recovered from that, decided this was not the job for me, and got a far better job as another improver, this time fitting carpets, and it was no real better, but I stayed for about a year.
Okay.
Then I got lucky, and somehow somebody gave me an apprenticeship in engineering
at the Royal Electric and Mechanical Engineers.
Yes, the army at the time would use civilian engineers. And they had workshops all over the country, and these workshops were huge. They were like small villages, really, and you could do any engineering thing you wanted.
Okay.
And they trained around about 30 apprentices a year. And so I was effectively employed by the Department of the Environment and attached to Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers for 4 years.
Oh, okay. And did you prefer that over your job as the working in the carpet? Was that right? Yeah.
Oh, crikey!
Just a little bit. Yeah.
I can still fit carpets today, but I'm not sure I could have made a living out of it. And my knees wouldn't have coped either.
Something you said there, got run over by a car.
Oh yeah.
I always see that in movies and things like that. I never heard, someone got hit by a car. I don't want to go and met someone who got hit by a car before.
Oh, so
congratulations.
Thank you. I hope my career went on to higher things.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. So this is actually something that popped out when I was looking across your CV on LinkedIn. So 1978, professional musician. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, in August of 78, the Department of the Environment made me redundant. So I'd done 4 years training to the day, and was no longer carried on. And so I was made redundant, and for the previous few years I've been playing the guitar in pop and rock bands around the place, and the opportunity to do this for a living presented itself. So I moved down to Plymouth and started a resident gig there where we were doing 5 nights a week in a big nightclub. These were called nightclubs. They're quite different from what we now understand to be nightclubs. They actually had resident bands. You were practically a member of staff.
Yeah.
And they were all over the country, big glitzy places usually. And I did a few residencies as well as solo work for about 4 years.
Okay. And so did you go that on your own? Did you go with some friends maybe?
Well, the first band I went pro with was we were a semi-pro band doing weddings and things, and this resident gig came up, so we all traipsed down to Plymouth to do it. Mm-hmm. But then another one in Southend and another one nearer to Colchester. They were relatively well paid considering that they were pro gigs, I suppose, and they were regular. You see, okay. Most musicians don't have regular gigs. It's just sort of 1 day at a time, and those were you'd be doing 3, 4, 5 nights a week.
Oh, right, okay.
So it's pretty lucky.
And so that was about 4 years, was that right? Did you say about 4 years?
I did about 4 years, but I also did solo things in that time and worked with different people. Just managed to scrape a living. Oh, just scraping a living. Well, I wouldn't claim any more than that.
Talking of scraping a living, you went to uni a few years after that, 1982. Tell me about that a little bit. So that was Northumbria.
Yeah, it was an interesting connection because I was playing we used to go up to the northeast of England and Scotland and the northwest as well, and we'd do 3 or 4 weeks of gigs, running around different gigs every night. So the whole band went up practically living in a van or a house that we'd hired. And while I was there, I was in a bookshop in Newcastle, picked up a book called How Children Fail, having never really read a book before I read this, and thought I was reading my own biography because it was a very interesting book. John Holt, How Children Fail. And it made me feel that actually that my abysmal performance at school wasn't entirely to do with me. And so I thought, I know what I'll do some A-levels, not really knowing what that involved. So went back to Colchester and whilst playing funded a couple of A-levels, 3 in the end, economics, sociology and politics. Found learning, discovered learning. I guess I was about 23 or something.
About 23, so roughly my age, and that's when you say discovered learning in the sense that you enjoyed doing this, or?
Oh yeah, I suddenly found I really liked the learning and it was lucky that I found the social sciences early on because that's what I've been involved with ever since, and the social sciences really interest me, what people are like, and particularly when they're in groups. So yeah, I was fascinated by as much by the subject, but also by the learning process.
Okay.
Discovering that I could learn.
So I've been a fan of learning and so if you think you had sociology maybe when you were sort of younger in high school, do you think you would have clicked onto that a bit more?
Probably not. The whole environment wasn't right. This is one of the things that's a problem with any education system, in my opinion, is that because, of course, there are so many young people there, you have to have a system, which means that many people will fit into that system, but of course many won't. So are we ready at age 16 to do GCSEs? Well, most people, but not everybody. Are we ready to do A-levels at 18? Most people, but not everybody. Are we ready to do a degree, 18 or whatever? Most people, but not everybody. So, my first degree was later, some people even later than that.
Yeah.
We're not all ready at the same time. We're not all receptive at the same time.
Do you think society has almost a timeline of what they expect a young person to do today?
It's an excellent question, Alex. Actually, I think there is that society in general. There is this feeling that you're supposed to be going through a certain trajectory, and for many that kind of works for many. Yeah. But I wouldn't want to put proportions on these, but for many it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so I remember feeling very pleased eventually that adult education existed, because when I discovered learning and that I could do it, there were these A-levels available, and I could go to adult education. And I remember my sociology class included a retired vicar and a number of other people. It was fascinating. But would I have been able to do that had adult education not existed? Not really. But there's a system that enables us to grow at the rate we want to. And so I was really appreciative and support adult education any time.
I come from sort of a background where the people that I used to go around would always complain that they didn't really want to go to school and things like this. But as I got older, as I say, having the opportunity to do that, I think it's very important for people to understand that if they're in some kind of rut, they don't have to stay in there. They can always learn, and especially in third world, it's often seen as education is a key to get out. One of the few keys.
I think that's important, but we should never kid ourselves that it's easy. You can. The opportunities to go and learn are there. Of course, it's become more commercial now, but the opportunities to learn are out there. And with the advent of the internet and the like, there's so many ways in which we can now learn. We don't need to go to an institution, but they're out there. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that it's easy. But if you're fascinated, if you're really, really interested, it gets a lot easier.
I think when we're children, we have an innate curiosity. So what's this? What's that? And as sometimes an adult, you have to say, "Don't touch that. It's hot. It's fire. Just don't do it." And I think sometimes as we get older, the system, as it were, can deter people from that innate curiosity. You've seen a lot of students. What do you think about students who are not creative in university? Do they feel they're on sort of a conveyor belt to just get a job and then use that degree almost minimalistically?
Okay. As you've pointed out, over what is it now? Well, over 2 decades now, I've seen a lot of students at different levels in different institutions. Some, like yourself, very engaged and fascinated by what they're doing. Others less so. What my own experience has taught me is that this is not because a student or a person are in some way lazy. It's just not the right moment, or that something's just not clicking for them, and something else will. I think there's something can switch on most of us. We just need to find it. And my own trajectory, which it's interesting you should use the word career. It makes it sound like I planned something. I really didn't. But my own has been a case of trying everything, really. Planting loads of seeds, seeing what grows.
Yeah.
Some doesn't grow, some does. I think that's a biblical reference, probably.
So that was just off getting to the BA in economics, and then after you completed that, according to your LinkedIn, Acoustics Consultant.
Weird one, wasn't it? There was a company in my hometown where I returned for a little while, and they were looking for an acoustics consultant, and I filled the form in. I had no idea where I was going with my, in quotes, career. And I got this job. I did ask them later why, and obviously my connection with the music industry was helpful.
Yeah.
Knowing about music and sound and things, they reckoned that was useful. And an economics degree meant that I'd probably demonstrate I could think, and maybe that I knew something about business, but of course I didn't. It was a fascinating time, and I did some very strange things during that time. Would you like to hear an anecdote?
I would love to hear an anecdote.
Oh, right,
as I'm sure the listeners would as well.
I'll keep it brief. Okay, I had to go and sort out a problem at the Scottish Exhibition Centre in Glasgow, where their acoustics were not good. That's the big one. That was 10,000 seater. There's also a 2,000 seater, and that involved me recording a number of big acts at the time, and then analysing the waveform and so on, and working out what the problem was. That was pretty fascinating. But at other times, I can remember spending the entire night on a hill just outside Sowerby Bridge, recording nothing before they built a new data centre.
Okay.
So that we could go back years later and record again and see if the data centre had introduced noise pollution. Now that might sound pretty tedious, but I promise you it was more than tedious. The whole night with nothing but bird tweeting going on. That was pretty unpleasant experience. There was a few others like that, pretty weird things that you get involved with. People think acoustics consultants, I don't know what they think about them really, but now you know.
And so was that, say, a Saturday night, a big night out for the acoustic consultants?
Cannot remember. You just did what the job required. It was pretty weird. But interestingly, it wasn't people enough. It was mostly technology. And I came to realise during that first 18 months there that I wanted a role that was more about people.
Okay, so that would probably explain the 1987 major events manager for 6 years. Probably might be apart from the education, looks like might be your longest sort of traditional job, I'd say. So tell me a bit about that. So you say you want a job with people. That sounds like something that'd be more in that ballpark.
Yeah, it was a charity, a voluntary sector organisation, fairly large childcare agency in the UK, and they needed a fundraiser basically, and once I was there it became mostly about events management. That's what it was. Interesting times, probably stayed too long, but it did tick the box of doing something perhaps a little bit more worthy than standing on a hill in Sowerby Bridge.
Are you sure about that? It's a pretty close thing.
I have reflected upon it, Alex, and it wasn't that good.
Okay, I don't know if I agree with you there. But so then we move on to 1994. I've got my notes here. Organisational decision making freelance in Hong Kong. Now this sounds interesting.
Oh, it's not as glitzy as it sounds. You know what LinkedIn is like. No, I was just teaching. I suppose we ought to backtrack a little bit and say that somewhere at the end of the time as a fundraiser, during that time I funded myself to do an MBA at Aston University.
Okay, that's what I couldn't figure out because you didn't have the dates on there.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
It's fine.
I funded an MBA at Aston and did that, and my dissertation supervisor asked me if I would do some tutoring for some undergraduates, and I said yes, and discovered I liked that teaching role. And so a role came up in a college in Birmingham, and I became a lecturer. And they had an arrangement with BCU, which was UCE at the time, University of Central England.
Okay.
And so I found myself here teaching with some people who I got on really, really well with. They became friends and colleagues. And so when a role came up at UCE, as it was, I applied and got it, and that's what I did. And did a PhD whilst I was here, supervised by one of the best academics I've ever known, actually, Martyn Brown.
Martyn Brown. What was his background? Why did you connect with him?
That's a really interesting question. We just found this similarity in the way we understood things. So he was my friend and colleague long before he was my PhD supervisor, which meant the whole supervision thing was a nice experience, albeit a long one. His background was psychology. Okay. Really, but he'd been involved in a lot of things like myself. He touched it.
Very diverse.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe that was part of the connection for us. But his main interest at the time we met, and for a long time, was Jungian psychology. Carl Jung, pupil of Sigmund Freud.
Now I've heard Carl Jung. I didn't know he was a pupil of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, Oedipus complex, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Those sort of areas, yeah. Okay, I need to read up on that. I might be having a session like this with a doctor of philosophy from another university.
Oh, okay.
Quite useful to...
you might need to do some serious reading.
Definitely, absolutely. So, after that, you've got your PhD at this time, is that correct?
Well, that took a long time because I was doing it whilst teaching and the rest of life and families and stuff. But yes, eventually the PhD was completed in 2009.
Okay.
So
also, that's quite afterwards. So you started at Birmingham City University. That's right, in 1998.
that's right, just about the time my daughter was born.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So how many children have you got?
I have 2 daughters. I have 1 stepdaughter and 2 stepsons. My goodness, I'm struggling with the numbers here. I'll start that again. 2 stepsons, 2 daughters, and 1 stepdaughter.
Have you got any brothers and sisters yourself?
I have 1 of each. I'm the oldest.
You're the oldest, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm the youngest. And there's whenever I go to my oldest, I've got 2 older brothers, and the oldest one, sometimes he can be very friendly, then the other times he can be almost switched on in the traditional older brother. What's it like to be the oldest?
Yeah, yet another really interesting question. Crikey. Well, I'm 61 now, and so we're talking about a lot of years of change and things. How do I see it? I don't, these days, if I did before, I need to apologise for it, but these days I do not see myself as in any way superior, simply older. Mm-hmm. And my life has taken a certain trajectory and path, and theirs has taken another one. And so we're all so different.
So that's a little bit about your family there. So going back to Birmingham City now, so started in 1998. What was your first impression then?
On the organisation or the industry? Or both?
Let's go for both. Let's go for both.
Okay.
Why not?
On the industry, what is apparent is that it's become much more commercially focused than it was when I was an undergraduate in 1982.
Yeah.
Not only was I given a small grant to do this, and the cost was covered, but the whole culture of the thing was completely different. Students' understanding was completely different. Students' attitudes to learning were quite different. Perhaps I ought to be a bit more detailed about it.
Maybe the attitude of the organisation first, or like the systems you say. So what changed from then, 98, till about nowish? From
98?
Yeah. All progressive changes, however you'd like to answer it.
It's getting more and more commercial, as I said.
Commercial.
It's largely these days about bums on seats. I don't sound too disparaging there. It's a commercial move, which I think is probably global. I work in other parts of the world, Hong Kong, Singapore, recently Greece, and the whole thing is commercial. It's all about bums on seats. So there is this kind of conflict which we have to manage between, on the one hand, the commercial imperative, and on the other hand, maintaining and improving standards. If you've got commercial pressures, then the pressure is downwards on standards, and so you've got this tension. Some might call it a creative tension, but a tension between these two things. And it hits staff and students, continuously balancing this tension between the commercial interests of the organisation on the one hand and the academic standards on the other.
I've seen some lecturers in my time. I've been at 2 separate universities, and during my time I've seen tutors who are more concerned about getting people into the classroom as opposed to expressing their syllabus in a way that makes it unique to them. So there is sort of, I think, an artistic side to being a lecturer. One thing that made me want to invite you is your description of the organisation and the history of it, especially the School of Athens, painting done by Raphael.
Raphael, the fresco, yeah.
And it's simply the way you talked around it that makes people want to come to those lectures.
Really?
Where if you see some other people who don't necessarily, I'm not going to say don't have the heart in it, because they clearly do, but it's a matter of engagement, and it feels like they're more there to, as you say, draw in, be there to fill the seats as a tool for the university, rather than really express a certain love for learning, like you said you found earlier in life. So that's just something, from my perspective, that I think has been quite important during my time at university.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. It does seem to me that the subject matter that I'm involved with, which is essentially organisation studies, lends itself to this more creative and imaginative approach. I can imagine some subjects don't lend themselves to that, but mine thankfully does, and so I can put up a 500-year-old painting on a slide and talk about it, and it can be illuminating or not depending on who's listening. I'm not sure you'd be able to do that if you were teaching accounting, although I'm sure my colleagues in accountancy would argue with me.
That's true, yeah. It's interesting you said that. That makes sense, actually. Well, there you go, changed my thinking a little bit there. Nice one. So, we'll go back to what you said about the students and how they've changed. Now, I imagine that one of the biggest changes was social media. Would that be sort of correct to say that?
I think the first thing to note is that the technology, the chip, and the social media that is the result, and so much more that's the result of it, we haven't even begun to see what this is going to do yet. I think it's going to take a prophet to work that one out. There are changes going to happen that we can't even imagine just yet. I think that's probably true. So what I'm about to speak about is probably just the very tip of this iceberg, my experience of it.
I mean, it's such a huge change. It's affected everyone's life.
Absolutely.
If you were to go back, say, 20 years ago, you see someone looking down at the crotch, you think, what's going on here? Do you know what I mean? Whereas now, so they've got a phone there.
Well, the technology is going to take us in places we can't imagine just yet. But it's clearly there's clearly a downside to this. The technology, it appears that the evidence suggests that this technology is addictive, and that cannot be good for anyone at all. And that actually the large companies producing this stuff, I'm fully aware that it's addictive, and they have teams of people working on how to keep you engaged on social media and other platforms, just so that the more time you're staring at a screen, the more chances you are going to buy something, which makes it attractive to advertisers, and away you go. It's the money. In terms of teaching, I'd say, sometimes students will be texting when they would probably be better off listening to whatever's going on. I actually don't have too much of a problem with it. Most students will respond to my saying, can we put the phones down now, it's just 1 hour, make a bit of a joke of it, and they're okay with that. Although I've noticed it's kind of, some of them find it difficult. There's the addiction element. Of course, the other thing the internet has done is made researching, I nearly said easier, probably easier, but definitely different. You've got all this stuff, there's so much out there, and because of the technology, we can get it in next to no time. I can pick up an iPad and research anything I want within seconds if I want to.
Anything,
The downside is a lot of it is rubbish. And so you need a discerning mind whilst looking at this stuff, and and I'm sure my colleagues tend to emphasise this discerning mind, and I think it's become more important as the technology has made so much material available, that the viewer, the consumer, if you prefer, is discerning. I think that's pretty important, which I think was always true of education. Education, as you said, it unlocks so much, and now discernment, pretty important. You can be confronted with huge amounts of stuff, and you've got to find out what's actually worth your energies.
Me and my friends were going quite deep now, we're discussing some things that are quite useful for life. And one thing that we all agreed on was you need a very good lie detector. You need to be able to see things that aren't necessarily what they are. That can be very, very helpful from what we discussed.
That's a very good point.
And it seems like just another example in a completely different field where having, I'd say, the right lenses on that will almost make it BS proof. You can be able to see what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I like your use of the word lens, one that I use a lot in teaching. I think that when we look at any situation, it's good to be able to look at it through more than one lens. Appreciate it from more than one perspective, whatever that might be, political stuff, whatever it might be that you're examining. Try to look at it through more than one lens if you can. I think that's a healthy thing to do.
Definitely. Is that something that you say students don't do enough of? I think you always get something from looking at a situation with fresh eyes, like you said. How do you feel about students, and especially the coming of age when they come to university?
Coming of age. I'm still coming of age. I think this is a lifelong process. It's not something that the institutions tell us happens at 18. I think you're still growing if you are open enough. I think that the answer that I would offer for me when I'm teaching is to draw attention for students to multiple perspectives. Once people realise there are multiple perspectives, they quite enjoy getting involved with seeing things in different through different lenses, and perhaps being less judgmental about a particular perspective, but seeing them as a rich picture of possible ways of interpreting whatever's being put in front of them. But they need to see that there's more than one perspective, and I think the early stages of an undergraduate degree, quite possibly before, is even just noticing that there's more than one perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perspective, and once you notice it, you can engage with it consciously, and it's fun. It's fun. So we will look at organisations, as you know, because you experienced all of this with us. But we would look at an organisation which is usually seen by people as some place you go to get money by doing certain work, and you come home and that's you 9 to 5 if you're lucky. But we examine organisations as sociological phenomena, psychological phenomena, symbolic phenomena, cultural phenomena. We see them the same thing through all of these different lenses. And I think for about 3 weeks, students on the module that you experienced have this feeling of being totally phased. Then after about 3 weeks, they kind of get it. Okay, so it's not as definite as I thought it was.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a place I just go off and learn, but there's all this political, cultural, social, technological, symbolic, psychological, stuff going on there. And oh my goodness, there's so much to learn. How fascinating! But not the first 3 weeks. Usually it's what's going on here?
Yeah. So we've got a few minutes left here. I've got a couple of questions now that are quite philosophical. Firstly, if you could give advice to your 20-year-old self, what would you say?
Oh, what a question.
For the listeners, Martyn has just gone into absolute concentration mode. You could not get a man with a more concentrated face right now.
It's true. My 20-year-old self. Okay, I think I would tell myself to be more confident with my heart and follow that. I did do that, but I never bristled with confidence. I think that it's good to believe that what your heart is telling you is probably the right way to go.
You think there's a lot of power in sort of following your gut and just going off instinct, maybe?
Yes. God gave us heads and hearts, and I think we were meant to use both.
Oh.
But our society tends to emphasise the head. I've been reading a fascinating book by Ian McGilchrist recently, a massive piece of work, in which he essentially says that our whole society has become biased heavily towards the left side of the brain, that is, logic, analysis, mathematics, calculation, etc. And the right side of the brain, which is actually driving everything, has been rather underplayed. And I think he couldn't be more right. For the last 300 years, at least in the West, the left side of the brain has been dominating everything. We think so much. We believe and feel a lot less, I think.
Yeah.
I'd like to tell my 20-year-old self, trust these feelings. They'll take you in the right place.
Jeez, I need to take a second. That was one hell of an answer there. Just for the listeners, what was the name of that actual piece by the author? Just in case I want to
the book is called The Master and His Emissary. Ian McGilchrist. That's Ian spelled I-A-I-N. Give him 20 years to write it.
There you go, 20 years. Yeah, read it. There we go. We're going to our next question. So what gives you the most joy in life?
Perhaps on a superficial level, I really enjoy being a musician, which I still am after 40-something years. Still play live, and that gives me a great deal of pleasure, and I think it's because it touches the right side of the brain. I'm mostly involved with jazz and improvising so it allows the spontaneity to get expression. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
But on a deeper level, my family, my daughter, my wife, my children and stepchildren matter hugely to me, and really enjoy the time that we have together. Working, I think working is important to me, by which I mean, if you're thinking about what do I tell my 20-year-old self again, work dignifies us. Work gives us a sense of purpose. And I strongly believe that organisations in the perhaps not so distant future will need to start thinking carefully about the meaning of the work that they give their people to do. We perform best, I don't even like the word perform, but we do our best when we're thoroughly engaged in what we're doing.
Yeah.
And if organisations can provide people with a sense of meaning and purpose in their work, and I don't mean enculturalise them so that they're just becoming automatons. I mean actually meaningful work, which means engaging with what the person wants as well. Then we will see a lot of changes. I believe we will likely to see a lot less corporate misbehaviour. We'll see a lot less stress in the workplace. Another issue, I'm sorry, I'm going off your question, but I really want to kind of say this.
Just on anything you like.
Well, I really think that the subjugation of women in the workplace is a major problem. We really don't understand what we're doing here. 50% of the workforce, with all that they can bring to the workplace, and it is different, is being undermined. Yeah, I think so. We need to address it. These are the issues of today. We need to address this: the meaning of work and the place of the women in the workplace. But may I ally to that another thought, which is that the problem we've got is too much masculinity. So when I talk about women in the workplace, I also want to talk about the feminine in the workplace, which males are quite capable of harnessing too.
I think from what I've seen around young males that I've just been engaged with, it is definitely you're trying to show that you're male to another male, to seem more male. Another great answer there, Martyn, I must say. What message would you give to the listeners?
Okay, well, assuming we don't know, then I don't know who the listeners are. My own experience, and I say this word career sounds like something planned. I don't remember doing that. I seem to bumble from one thing to another, and some of it I found great, some of it less so. But what would I say? I'd say probably a couple of things. One is, will you look back and say, I tried as many things as possible to see if I could find myself and what I'm about. I think we need to try as much as possible and see what we're about. You'll know what's working for you and what's not on an emotional level. But you have to try a lot of things to do that. And some of it works and some of it doesn't. Don't be frightened to stick neck out there and try. That's one. The second one, if we're discussing jobs and careers and that kind of stuff, be nice to people. I know that sounds really corny, but I don't care. Be nice to people. I really think that matters. In the workplace, the pressure is on to win in some sort of Darwinian sense, but the pressure is on to survive no matter what, and I think maybe that needs to be tempered with a little bit of what Adam Smith called fellow feeling. Yeah, we need to concern ourselves with each other. Well, there you go. What a message from Martyn Brown. Thank you for coming on, Martyn. Appreciate it very much. Pleasure. Enjoyed it. This was a pleasure to do, and I wish you all the best. If you do go out for boarding bird sounds, feel free to not give me an invite. But thank you for doing this. It's appreciated. I loved it. Really interesting. You have been listening to Alex and the Message. If you stayed to the end, please drop a like, leave a comment and subscribe for weekly uploads. For regular updates, you can also follow me on social media, firstly on Twitter as A&TheMessage and also on Instagram as AlexAndTheMessage. Thanks for listening and have a great day.